Well, good morning, everyone. I had 2 hours sleep. How about the rest of you? Very good. Glad to see so many of you here. So welcome to this press briefing for the 19th of December, 2022, the last day of the United Nations Biodiversity Conference here in Montreal. I'm David Ainsworth. I'm Head of Communications for the United Nations Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I can say that I'm kind of dizzy and a little bit giddy with the results of the early morning. It was only a little while ago. As you may know, the Conference of the Parties adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework just a few hours ago. The framework is a historic agreement. It's a balanced text that provides a strong basis for parties to the Convention and the world, indeed, to move forward towards achievement of the 2050 vision of the Convention, living in harmony with nature. So there were 6 documents agreed last night. There was CBD/COP/15/L25, which is the text of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. There was also /L26, which was the monitoring framework for the Global Biodiversity Framework. There was L27, mechanisms for planning, monitoring, reporting, and review. There was L28, capacity building and development, and technical and scientific cooperation. L29, a document on resource mobilization, and L30, digital sequence information on genetic resources. These were introduced as a package by the presidency, and then following extensive consultations over the afternoon and evening, were passed as a package early in the evening. Just note to journalists here in the room and those online is that Eurovision, the host broadcaster, has full high-definition files of the plenary for the last few hours, so you can liaise with them and visit their website for these. And also, I sent a link to the Flickr account, so you've got photos in this area as well. If you have any other details about the documents you need, please send an email to myself and to Franca, and we'll make sure those are available for you as well. So here in this last day, we still have a lot of work to do. Working Group 1 is about to start meeting, and they will complete the last work on their final CRPs on the financial mechanism, the Global Environment Facility, the long-term approach to mainstreaming, and knowledge management. And then we will have a plenary today. I have it listed at 2:40 or 3 o'clock, we'll see the timing, where the COP and the COP MOPs of the protocols will adopt the final decisions of this conference. There are some 40-plus documents to consider, and also we need to close the meeting. So we'll get the closing statements from the COP15 presidency, our executive secretary, Elizabeth Maruma Emrema, and the executive director of UNEP, and others. All of this will take a while, so it's expected easily that the meeting for the plenary will go on through the afternoon, and it's possible into the early evening. Not till 4 o'clock in the morning, but still into the evening as well. We have scheduled a press conference with the COP15 presidency at 2 p.m. today. I'm hoping we can take that time, but given the heavy agenda, it may change. We'll let you know how that goes as well. The other thing is we do intend to have a short technical briefing on the content of the Kunming-Montreal Framework following the press briefing with the presidency. Basil Van Havre and Francis Ogwal, the co-chairs of the Open-Ended Working Group, have agreed and come to speak with you and talk with you about the technical content of those documents. We have press conferences that will take place over the course of today, reactions to the Kunming Biodiversity Framework. That's all I have to announce for now. I will take questions from the floor. I imagine there may be a fair number, so please raise your hands and we'll have microphones brought around to you. Let's see here. Well, I think we'll start right in the back here. We got a microphone to them? I suppose I should put my glasses on so I can see who's there.
Hi, David. I'm hoping you can explain why, despite the opposition last night from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the United Nations was able to go ahead, the plenary was able to go ahead and adopt the framework, and maybe you could also just explain the difference in terms of UN protocol between unanimity and consensus.
Yeah, certainly. So the notion of consensus, I know, is very, very challenging, and I've spoken, I think, a lot with a lot of you over the last little while. So consensus does not mean that a single party can indeed block all of the things that goes on. In the process of consensus, there are consultations that go on. There are discussions, there are recognitions of differences of opinion, and then what happens is in the event that you still have a strong objection, it is possible for that objection to be noted in the reports, noted in the decisions that are adopted, and for things still to proceed. With regard to the question of the comments by the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is noted that the first texts of the Kunming Declaration and its associated documents were introduced early on yesterday afternoon. There was an extensive discussion in the heads of delegation meeting that took place from 11 a.m. to, I think, almost 4 o'clock. That included a recognition of the comments by the DRC. Following that, there were extensive bilateral and multilateral discussions that took place, including discussions with DRC. In fact, you will note that the plenary was originally scheduled to take place at 7:30, and we opened it well after, 3:30, 4 a.m. in the morning. And so there were extensive consultations with the DRC at that time. So it was indeed noted. From a procedural point of view, the adoption is completely legal. It is also noticed that the credentials of the DRC at that point in time were provisional. And further, while there was a comment from the floor of the DRC about their concerns with the framework, there was no formal objection raised. Please note, there was no formal objection raised by the DRC in that matter. And on that basis, without a formal objection, there's no process to go forward for blockage. So I think it's important to note a couple of things. So the first thing is that it is clear from the comments that took place in the heads of delegation meeting and onwards that there was an incredibly strong basis of support for the framework, overwhelmingly. And further, that there were another of other objections and concerns to the framework that were addressed in the other discussions later on. It is acknowledged that moving forward on this framework, the question of trust and consensus and communication will be exceedingly important. And so, the parties, I think, have recognized that. And indeed, the comments that followed and the comments that are taking place today reflect the need for us to have these discussions moving forward. There's my long-winded answer to your question, Gianna. Let's take over here. I'll take up the front. I guess that's our colleague from... Oh, that's a new person I've recognized. Take the mic. Don't be shy. Take the mic.
Lindsay Botts from Sierra Magazine in the U.S. I have a question about implementation. Can you just talk a little bit about going forward until 2030, what mechanisms will kind of be used to ensure that countries actually adopt some of these goals and measures?
Okay, so you'll note that the framework has the targets and goals in it as well, and there are these other associated documents that talk about resource mobilization, that talk about capacity building, that talk about the monitoring and implementation framework. So with the final adoption of all the results at this COP, parties will go back and they'll be expected to mobilize their national biodiversity strategies and action plans in support of the framework. The national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or NBSAPs, becoming the main instrument to implement the convention at the national level. And so they will be expected to take these results and mainstream them into those. I do want to note that you should probably see soon an announcement of an NBSAP accelerator program that's organized by the United Nations Environment Program, the United Nations Development Program, and others that will be assisting countries to ensure that they're mainstreaming all of the principles of this framework into their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So that is it. The other part to note is that during the biennium between now and COP16, parties will be expected to take the overall monitoring and indicator framework and align what they do at their national level with the principles at that point in time. So there are a lot of steps going forward. And then, of course, the question of resource mobilization. Remember that there was a call for the Global Environment Facility to create a global biodiversity fund that would be implemented as soon as possible once their Assembly and Council can ratify it next year and move forward on that. So it's a lot of different steps. I think what you'll want to do over the next little while is follow information from us and notifications and see how things go forward. Thanks. I'll take the third row first, and then we'll go back up to the front to Stella. Don't worry, I'll get to all of you. We have a lot of time this morning.
Emilia Fournier, APTN National News, the Indigenous TV network in Canada. I'm wondering what the implications, the legal implications are for Indigenous peoples with this new agreement, and also if the UN is considering including Indigenous nations at the same level as countries are in future COP conferences.
So, I mean, you're correct that within the framework there are multiple references and some interesting movements forward on the involvement and implication of Indigenous peoples and local communities, whether this is in the question of protected areas, whether it's in the question of invasive alien species, and a whole variety of things. So, I won't be able to go into all the details, but I would invite you to look at the specific targets and look at the language. There it is. But it does recognize the rights, the responsibilities, and the specific expertise of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Your second question is exceedingly important. So you'll know that under the convention currently, even before this meeting, we have Article 8J, and Article 8J recognizes the importance and the special position of traditional knowledge related to the conservation and sustainable use of Indigenous and local communities. And it also has meant that there's a working group that we have under the convention where Indigenous peoples and local communities in that working group are on equal standing with parties in anything discussed in that group. So that's another important element. I think the other thing too is you'll note that the IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, has also recently done an extensive framework on traditional knowledge, putting it at the same level as other forms of knowledge in the world. Now, one of the important parts that moved forward, which is outside of the global framework, and this was adopted in a plenary at the middle, was an agreement by parties to reevaluate and to expand and extend the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the convention process. So over the next 2 years, parties and an ad hoc technical expert group will evaluate the existing role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in traditional knowledge and evaluate whether that can be indeed expanded and move forward, and the proposal will come to COP16. This is particularly important given the target on protected areas in the framework, but also given some of our other areas. Under the convention process, in addition to traditional protected areas, there's been a lot of discussion of something called other effective area-based conservation measures. And the Indigenous conservation areas, ICAs, are an important part of that. And so the work that we're doing here is going to be a space to bring that forward and open it up. So I think that your work and coverage here in Canada, as well as others that will be looking at this in other parts of the world, should be looking at how this consultation will expand. So it's a good possibility, and there's indeed really a lot of space for those kind of consultations and dialogues. Thanks very much. I'll take Stella, and then we'll go to other ones.
Thanks, David. Can you explain a little bit about at what point China hands over the presidency to, till how long they stay in the lead, and when do they actually transfer it over to Turkey? And also, there would be a stock taking, right, in some time, in a few years, like a stock taking of the implementation process. When is that expected? Thank you.
So the Chinese presidency will be, it was active when we actually had the first part of Kunming that took place last year, and they will continue to be the presidency until the opening of COP16, which is going to be, as you said, the presidency of Turkey. Just everyone notice it's not Turkey anymore, it's Turkey. So it's very important to note that. That will be. So until then, China will be, they will be guiding the presidency. So they will be, guiding the subsidiary bodies, the implementation body and the science body, along with the new chairs, etc. With regard to the stock taking, there's a couple of moments. I mean, we'll be looking at national reporting frameworks that'll be talked about. That'll give us interim steps as well. By the middle of the decade, which is actually only in 3 years, there'll be an important stock taking of how we're moving on the framework as well. But I think certainly the national reporting. So you should expect that we'll be looking at reporting frameworks that'll take place at every COP for certain parts of the framework, and that'll be explained in the decisions, but certainly at the midterm and at the end. We do have a challenge before us because when this framework was originally conceived, it was meant to be something for 10 years, and we don't have 10 years anymore, so it will shorten some of that. Thanks very much. I'll take Natasha over here, and then we'll go back to the other side. Sorry, there's more people asking questions over here, but I want to make the left-hand side feel important too.
Thank you. Just some clarification on what the working group is doing this afternoon or now, particularly the one on the financial mechanism. Is there any chance that they could change the text? And so what was agreed last night?
Yeah, no, what they're discussing now is text on the financial mechanism, and that's a separate conference room paper, a decision there that while it reflects and coordinated with what was adopted last night, it's a different document indeed, because what happens is the guidance you saw last night was the role of the GEF and resource mobilization specific to the framework. There's always a decision at our COPs, which is guidance to the financial mechanism of the GEF. So identifying the programs of work and priorities of the convention that should be considered by the assembly of the GEF. And so that is semi-independent. So, and certainly that it would be expected that if there's any need to coordinate those documents, they will indeed be coordinated. It would be exceedingly unusual for a contradictory program or document to come out of the financial mechanism. But that's one of the things they're looking at, is finalizing that decision to be adopted in the final COP area. And of course, they're also looking at knowledge management and mainstreaming matters.
But the fund, the biodiversity fund, has been agreed and adopted.
Yeah, the text that you saw last night in the resource mobilization strategy sent directions to the GEF, instructing them to take the necessary steps to create this global biodiversity fund, and in particular, interesting to configure it in such a way that it could receive resources from a variety of sources, public and private, which is a very interesting direction. Thanks. Take over from this side here, maybe so maybe right at the back, the woman with the pink mask first, and then after that, the gentleman ahead of her in the row ahead of her.
Thanks. Alison Lampert with Reuters. Just to confirm, so this framework was reached by consensus, and what does that mean in terms of the Congo? What options would they have if they wanted to do anything to try to challenge it, or could they possibly just not adopt it in by their domestic government?
Well, under the convention process, when a decision is made, it is indeed, binding, and I'll explain why I put in quotation marks. It's binding on all parties to the convention, so 195 parties, and the European Union did. So they are mandated to move and carry it forward in this case. So they wouldn't, if they indeed decided not to implement it, it would be in contravention to the action of the convention. I mean, however, I think one thing it's important that the dialogue and process going forward will be exceedingly important. So indeed, any concerns that were raised by the DRC or other parties to the convention, including if they're from different regions, not just of Africa, they would be part of the dialogue moving forward. But this framework does remain the basis for things going forward. And again, I want to note that the DRC did not raise a formal objection, which is an important procedural step for this. Thank you very much. Gentleman just ahead of her.
Hi, thanks. Nathan King, CGTN. Just a bit on the diplomatic TikTok of this whole thing, because it was very despondent Wednesday, Thursday, when we had walkouts, et cetera, and then, of course, we had the adoption of the text last night. In your opinion, or in your view, how did this sort of consensus come about? And it's kind of a weird setup here where we have a Chinese presidency and a Canadian host. How have you seen those two countries work together?
So I think, did you use the word despondency? Is that the word you used?
I think there was that word was used in the press a couple of times on Wednesday,
interesting.
Thursday,
Okay.
after the walkout.
Okay, so so it's interesting. So in the course of the negotiations, and any process, whether it's here in the biodiversity conference, the climate change process, CITES, Ramsar, any of these or whatever, there's always an interesting ebb and flow of emotions, of moving forward on consensus, of expression of differences of opinions. And so, I mean, the press is, you're all free to have your opinion of despondency. I'm not sure if all parties to the convention would say that particular process. I mean, you will note that we did have the walkout that took place for, I think, a grand total of 7 hours, maybe not even 8 hours. And in fact, following that heads of delegation meetings, discussion started again. So indeed, it was a very short-lived period of walkout. And there are a variety of different, I don't want to call them tactics, but different ways that parties express concern and move forward. So it's not clear that despondency is the word that everybody would be using for this. In terms of moving forward, I mean, the presidential text that was created on the basis of ongoing discussions with everyone else. And you will note that the comments that came from a variety of parties, ones that reported in the heads of delegation meeting and afterwards, there was a large basis of consensus for that. In fact, if it was indeed despondency with everyone, we wouldn't have heard the rounds of applause that we heard during the meeting from a large number of people going onwards. These are complicated processes. This framework is exceedingly complex. It's got 4 goals, it's got 23 targets, it's attempting to balance the 3 objectives of the convention: conservation, sustainable use, equitable sharing of benefits. It's trying to address new financial mechanisms. It's trying to address some new technologies such as digital sequence information. So there are a lot of moving parts. And indeed, I think trying to address all of those moving parts in those bilaterals between the release of those documents and indeed later expresses it. But we got to the point where it was at that point where there was a vast basis for consensus moving forward on it. So it's a case of it doing very well. With regard to the host government and the presidency, I mean, this is something people have talked about for some time. It is an unusual situation, but it's happened in the UN process before, where you will have the political leadership of a presidency, and then you may have a host that does different things. Certainly under the climate process, I know that when Fiji was the presidency, they held meetings in Bonn, and so Germany was in fact the presidency and did similar to what Canada did, provided the venue and logistics. I also, in the case when Chile under the climate process was not able to discharge their duties to hold the meeting, they went to Spain, and there was a similar process as well. So that happens where you've got these two roles. I think it's fascinating and really interesting to see that over the course of these weeks, we have seen both the Chinese presidency and the Canadian host working side by side, demonstrating willingness to move forward. Even before the meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, both governments held interministerial consultations on the framework and also did consultations here as well. So again, you know, there's a great deal of harmony and discord. There's always a different way to look at it. You can always look at where we fell short, but I think something that's fascinating to see is what were we able to achieve, and what was the world in this time when multilateralism is very fragile able to achieve at this meeting. Thanks very much. Let me take, I'll take over here, the gentleman in white, and then I'll go back to Ivan from the Globe and Mail. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Mark Shapiro with the Earth Journalism Network and with Inside Climate News, writing a story. So there's an agreement on DSI and ABS, which of course is a first. But I was wondering what that means for the countries that have existing ABS programs, Brazil, India, there are a couple of others. And then whether those programs provide a kind of floor from which the process itself will be drawn over the next 2 years.
Gosh, sorry, Mark, that's an exceedingly technical question. I'm not sure I'm sufficiently brief to get in on that one. I mean, I think you will know that the decision on digital sequence information indicates that people need to move forward, both in the question of the definitions and on the variety of multilateral benefit sharing mechanisms here. I mean, you know, the challenge we've got with this is how do we ensure that these new technologies are incorporated with existing provisions of the Nagoya Protocol. So, sorry, Mark, I'm going to have to pause on this one, and we'll see if we can get you some experts or some of the members of the countries themselves who can speak to you on that one. Sorry about that. Thanks very much. Ivan, please.
Thanks, Ivan Semenik from the Globe and Mail. So, David, actually, I have a very similar question, but maybe you can elaborate on the relationship between the Nagoya Protocol and the new biodiversity framework. Just, I mean, obviously, the new framework includes DSI and talks about the need for policy and legal mechanisms. Is there any other document or any other elaboration on those mechanisms at this point? And does Nagoya play a role?
So I think you need to look at the targets to the Global Biodiversity Framework, because indeed, even within the targets themselves, there are discussions about the role of the different protocols and implementation of it. So whether it's the Cartagena Protocol or the Nagoya Protocol. So the targets that look at how they are there, because the Global Biodiversity Framework indeed does need to be consistent with existing obligations under Nagoya, et cetera. I mean, the decisions relating to the Nagoya Protocol at the meeting are still considerable, and we need to look at, you know, how we move forward on the overall question of a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism. There's also the question of specialized mechanisms. How do we deal with questions of access and benefit sharing for, say, research, for, say, the question of health matters, et cetera, like that? Those are going to be moving forward in there. I guess in some ways we focused on the fact that digital sequence information is this new area, and then it was highlighted as something that had to be incorporated for it. But the work on the protocol continues to be mainstreamed into the work of the other targets there.
Just a quick follow-up. Is your feeling that the disappointment by some of the African representatives yesterday, was that linked to the DSI because it was a strong red line for them earlier in the conference?
I don't think I could comment on their disappointed their positions or whatever. So I think you'd have to check with people from the region on that. Thanks very much. Okay, good. We'll take a question here in the second row.
Hi, Jack Graham, Thomson Reuters Foundation. I was wondering on the accountability mechanisms. There was some disappointment about the fact amongst some groups that the deal was to say that they may take the reviews into account as opposed to should take reviews into account. What can the CBD do and the process do to force some kind of accountability on those plans?
So I think the word force is something you never want to see within the process. This is indeed a consensual process. This is the process of international law, most of it which is exceedingly soft. So the word force is not generally used in that case. So I mean, I think you'd have to look at the specific language. That's why people discussing whether or not things are mandatory not is an important part there. So I don't think there is a mechanism for it. But again, I'm going to pause because again, this is becoming an exceedingly technical briefing for me right now. And remember, I'd only finished reading the text about 2 hours ago as well. So pause on that. Thanks. I'm going to move to the other side of the room over there. We've got a question. A woman just got an orange scarf on.
Hi, I'm Rita Gupta from the Earth Journalism Network. So my question's about some confusion about reducing the overall risk from pesticides because there was no agreement on reducing use. Is there some mixed messaging, especially because it's the first time there's text later on talking about, agroecology and things like that in the food target without reducing use of pesticides?
Sorry again, at the risk of this, my briefing started to degenerate in terms of, I don't know the details here. But you're right, it is exceedingly complicated that we need to look at the implementation of the pollution target and its consequences for food security matters later on. I mean, I know that was one of the language that we're looking at, and so parties will be looking at moving forward. But I don't have that text like right in front of me right now, so I can't specifically comment, but I think you have highlighted potential tensions that'll have to be resolved in the next little while. Thanks very much. I think I'll go to, I'll take the woman here with the long hair. Yep, right there. And then we'll go to the other side.
Hello, my name is Sophie Arclay from Collège International Maï de France. There was a lot of opposition for this decision. Would you say that a certain weariness of the diplomats and also a need for a Montreal moment sort of rushed this decision and maybe even blocked certain more advanced discussion?
So you're asking me to really look at opinions and stuff here. So, and I don't really have opinions. I mean, I think consistent with some of the things I've said before. I mean, the parties have since 2018 and COP14 indicated their ongoing support to achieve a ambitious, realistic, and transformative global biodiversity framework in this case. And so there's always been that expression by parties all throughout the years of negotiation, the 5 meetings of the open-ended working group, the meetings of the subsidiary bodies that provided support and information. Parties have always said they wanted to move forward on this. And indeed, in terms of opposition, I mean, I think you need to reflect that when the presidential text was issued, the reactions from many of the parties, there was a strong, overwhelming reaction from a lot of it. So I'm not sure in terms of strong resistance, if that's what you would say. If there was indeed strong resistance, we'd probably still be in the plenary room waiting for texts to be looked at and move forward. It's indeed the question that the world is wondering. We need to move on this. Do you say it's because there was a need for a Montreal moment? I mean, I think the clear matters is that the world recognizes that the nature of the crisis facing biodiversity, the nature of problems with conservation, sustainable use, are recognized as something we have to move forward on for sure. And the governments recognize that, and that's why they did agree to move forward on this package that they did. Thanks very much. On this side over here. Oh, Natasha, I already had a question from you. I'm gonna wait. Sorry. I mean, I've given you a lot of questions this week, I feel, so we'll see. Anyone else on this other side? Yeah, right in the back row, please.
Hi, I'm Morgan Lowry, Canadian Press. We were trying to find out who was the delegate from the Democratic Republic of Congo who spoke up in the plenary. We asked, and I mean, it wasn't the environment minister, and we heard that it's not entirely sure who it was, and that the secretariat's looking into confirming that. Do you have any information?
Yeah, the names of the delegates and participants actually under a process, we only release the names of participants in our conference near the end. Partly it's a technical issue, partly it's just confirming everyone's credentials and matters. So yeah, I wouldn't even have that information. It wasn't the environment minister, but that's not unusual. Within our process, it's not always the environment minister who sits at the particular table at that point in time. So anyway, but I mean, there is this question of the nature of credentials for everybody in the meeting that are still being verified in this case. So thanks. Okay, Natasha, you know what? You get a bonus prize.
Punishment for you, because I'm going to ask you a technical question.
Oh, my Lord.
What do countries have to do to raise a formal objection? And what's the difference between a formal objection and an informal objection? And did the DRC know that they weren't raising a formal objection?
So, I mean, I can't speak to what the DRC does or doesn't know. I mean, I think you'll have to ask representatives of the DRC in that case. But indeed, there is the question of it being, to raise to the presidency as a formal objection to the process. And then for a formal objection to be raised, indeed, it's got to be clear that the credentials of the party making it are fully in line and that they're nothing provisional. Thanks very much. Question behind you. There's a.
Hi, I'm Christina with the Newswire DPA. Could you maybe briefly lay out where this goes from here? So how is sort of the path to COP16? How and where does this go? Just sort of in a brief overview.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
I mean, there are a lot of moving parts, as you say. So indeed, so the framework has been adopted. So parties are expected to, as they move forward on their processes for the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, align them with the needs of the targets, not only for this biennium, but going forward as well. The parties will also look at national reporting that takes place over the decade and look at that forward. With regard to the Global Environment Facility, the instructions are that their assembly, which is due to take place next year, needs to put into motion the needs to move forward on these matters. I mean, there are other initiatives. I mentioned the accelerator partnership for the NBSAPs. That's something that will be moving forward and help countries prepare for that as well. Under the convention process, we'll have a number of other things taking place. So the subsidiary body in science, technology, and technological assessment and subsidiary body in implementation will have an agenda before them where they will look at continuing to refine the scientific and monitoring basis for things forward. With regard to the monitoring framework, we'll have an ad hoc technical expert group that will continue to refine and make sure that those headline indicators are created and managed at the national level. So in terms of following the intergovernmental process, you'll want to look at when our substas and our SBI meetings, the subsidiary bodies meet and move forward towards COP16. There are some reporting requirements. And for example, also the digital sequence information is expected to have some matters resolved between then as well. So you'll need to follow our meetings, our expert meetings, but then also at the national level, reporters here and around the world will need to look at how our national government's moving forward and mobilizing a lot of these elements as well. So it's a great deal of work, but I know we had 1,000 of you here at this meeting. So if you can mobilize another 1,000 in the other countries, you can keep track of the process. Thanks very much. Anything else over here? I'm just seeing, no? It looks like you have a follow-up though. I'm being very nice to this side of the room because there's a couple of keeners over
I'm
here.
so sorry. Just a brief follow-up. Do you have any details yet about when and where COP16 will be held?
So COP16 will be held in Turkey. So the specific location, I think, has yet to be determined, but in this closing plenary, we should have that. I don't know. I've heard different cities that it may be held, but I don't think it would be appropriate for me to mention those in a speculative way. You could talk to Turkey and see what they think. Okay. In 2024. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. So I think there'll be another press conference happening here soon. The working group will begin. And yes, and I do hope that we'll be having this press conference at 2 p.m. with the presidency, but with the fact that the entire agenda is décalé a little bit backwards, we may have some uncertainty. Thank you very much.